even if you're the staunchest Republican, I think even they would, look at the qualities of the late Queen and think, there is a life well lived, completely self-sacrificial, a vision of Christian dignity.
Okay, today we have Brendan Thompson from Word on Fire. He is the first employee outside of the United States to work for Word on Fire. He's here with his beautiful British accent, and we're going to talk about his work and his life and so on. Welcome, Brendan.
Good to be here.
Yeah. Sheena,
good to have you here.
What questions do you want to ask Brendan?
What's it like to have met Bishop Barron?
I remember the first time.
I suppose we should preface, what is Word on Fire? It's Bishop Barron organization, right?
Yeah, so actually in 2025, the Jubilee year, Word on Fire is going to celebrate its 25th anniversary.
Wow.
And so for many people who would have heard of Bishop Barron, will know him from his Catholicism series. So this, it's an amazing project, just this entrepreneurial spirit to say, the church shouldn't be reduced to, it should meet the challenges of, for example, the clerical abuse crisis, but it shouldn't be reduced to that there's a story to tell, that there's a beautiful vision, and the new media, as it's called, is a great way. And so he's just been a pioneer, really. And so many people as I go around the world are just really inspired. And I think he has a real charism as a preacher and teacher. And certainly that's my own experience as one who's been inspired and now, have the great privilege, the dream job really of trying to see how this movement that began with Bishop is continuing to grow and spread around the world.
Wow. So what was it like to meet him?
So I remember the first time I met him. So I was doing my master's in Oxford on St John Henry Newman and his insights, or what he could teach about the practice of the new evangelization. And I was procrastinating and looking at social media like any good student. And I saw that Bishop Barron was filming his series on Newman, his Pivotal Player series, across the road. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just accidentally on purpose bump into him. And so I went and said hello in a kind of fanboy way of like, oh, thank you so much, Bishop Barron, for everything you do. And he was like, he just humored me. And I was like, that's very nice. But it was Newman's hand of providence, I believe, was all over this, because many years later, it was John Henry Newman was being canonized, and I was there in Rome in October 2019, and I bumped into the Word on Fire team, and they had remembered this silly little British boy who had, kind of doorstepped them as they were trying to do filming. And I pitched a crazy vision to them of this tour and said we could do this amazing thing, and there's so much opportunity in the UK church, and particularly I was thinking, having served for 15 years in the church in England and Wales, and I just love it so much, and I wanted them to be able to experience. He'd been to England loads of times and he's been to Ireland, and I just wanted to help him to see what I saw. And, thank God they've kind of responded with great generosity to that desire to invest in the UK church.
Wow. So what did they do? Did they come and do the tour?
Yeah, so I said it started as one event. So I said, we come and do something. You've got, the Word on Fire Institute, this online platform. So why don't we do an event for members here? And they said, yeah, okay. I thought I started to get a bit bolder, my foot's in the door. And so I said, while you're here, you might as well do, a talk in Parliament for, civic and religious leaders. And they were like, yeah, that sounds good, worthwhile. I've not done that before. And I said, well, you're here for a talk in Parliament and another event. We might as well do a conference for 1,300 people. I'd never done a conference for, let's say, more than 100, or an event for more than 100. But, it was just kind of put out into the deep, right? Mm-hmm. I just thought, well, we've got this opportunity, and I thought, I never know whether this is going to happen again. I really wanted to kind of take it for all it's worth, in a sense. And, they were very generous and kind to me. They just kept saying yes. So I basically ended up filling this whole week, and it was the most extraordinary professional week of my life, I would say, in like ministry in the church. It was just like the wings felt unclipped, and I was just able to just really serve. And I wanted to, Bishop Barron's really inspired. One of his great saint heroes is St Thomas More, so I was able to take him into the cell in the Tower of London where St Thomas More stayed like for the last part of his life, and wrote this amazing poetry. And it was such a joy to be able to, in a way, it was my way of thanking Bishop for all the ways in which he had inspired and helped to shape and form me, even though he never knew who I was. And, I'm just one of many people who's like that.
Like when you're talking there, I can't help think of all the dots that are connecting. Like you're doing your master's on evangelization, and then you are going out and being a part of the mission. You're bringing him here. You're on that wave of the new evangelization. Like, what would you say to people who, like, and you had no experience, but you did it anyway? You know what I mean? Like, what would you say to people who have crazy ideas like that? And
like leaving their business and joining a ministry, for example.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
But it's true. What would you say to people who maybe have something in their heart that they really want to do something and they're a bit afraid?
Yeah. This is tough learning to live on the kind of wavelength of Providence. There's a lovely, I'm going to misquote it slightly, but Newman said something along the lines of significant interactions between individuals are never accidental, they're providential. But because God gives us freedom, it's whether we make anything of those. This is like God is putting lots of opportunities there, and he would that we had the grace and the vision that God wants, to say that word, ephatha, be open to see as he sees. And it's kind of the nature of repentance, isn't it? To kind of open our vision to see as God sees. And I guess if this was a self-help talk, you'd say like, just go for it, build your dreams and do all this kind of stuff. But I just think that just feels a bit fallacious. It's like it wasn't that I was intentionally ever thinking I want to do something crazy for God. Because, in a way, there's always these tensions to balance, isn't it? That to be prudent. And actually I'm, I've got a family now. And so there's
3 children.
Within that, 3 little girls and a wife. And so it wouldn't be prudent to be reckless. And, it was easier to do that when you're 18 and the church discerns as well. So it's always testing these things, in those wider spheres. Like, what does this mean in my role as a husband, with my family, with the church, and have these conversations. So I always put it within the key of relationship. So I'd say friendship is the ordinary forum of evangelization. And friendship's that ordinary place that these things should happen. So it's not about me as an individual saying like, oh, wouldn't it be great if I just do my crazy plans? It's always the best ones have always been a fruit of conversation and a deepen of minds and hearts and communion with others. And it's the same for Bishop Barron, actually, when I was really inspired when I think the Catholicism series was a fruit of basically him complaining about the church in what I would regard as a pub. He's down the pub putting the world to rights with a friend, and he said, well, stop complaining and do something about it. And
Yeah, absolutely. It was going through a bad time, and probably still is going through a bad time, but he did something about it.
Yeah,
to show the church in a good light. I knew him before the Catholicism series, and I'm trying to think why I knew him before the Catholicism series. I watched the Catholicism series and I was so impressed by it, but he was on my consciousness before then. What was he involved in before that? Was it all Word on Fire online?
So he'd done academic studies in Paris and Catholic University of America. Was a famed, I think, retreat giver. I think he'd come to England a few times, to give retreats. So he was already a retreat giver. And I'd say his principal charism really is for preaching and teaching. And that skill and that art and that docility to the Holy Spirit kind of helping that to grow in him has been the fruit of many years. So I think it's easy to look at, isn't it nice to be in front of a camera, and it's all very kind of glamorous, but it's graft. It's really hard work, and it's a lot of those hidden years. So I think of that image of the, the iceberg. It's everyone sees what's on the top, but it's the hidden years of study, of prayer, of conversation, of suffering, of holy friendships, and going the wrong way,
gradual dying to oneself.
Exactly.
And I've heard people who we've had on the show talk about him, who've spoken at conferences with him, and he's anecdotally from their experience, he's the one who spends the most time in adoration during a conference, praying before he'll speak. So what we see is not, is the fruit of his adoration, is the fruit of his prayer, but we don't get to see him in adoration, and yeah, it's good to appreciate just how much time he spends in prayer.
I've been very blessed in my life. I don't know whether it's a maybe it's a lack of self-awareness, but I've just always had this kind of, let's just see if something will happen. I remember I was at World Youth Day in Krakow, since 2016, and it was 2 weeks before I was about to get married. It's kind of very interesting marriage prep. You walk like for miles and miles in the blistering sun to
And
a
was
field
your
with 2 million
fiance
people.
with you?
Yeah, she was. So it was good. It's like if you've survived that, you survive anything. And I remember we got bored and we went to the EWTN tent and we didn't see anyone there. And we just kind of as a joke prayed a prayer to St. Anthony. And then suddenly it was Jason Everett and Chris Stefanik turned up and we were like, oh, this is amazing. And we said, oh, let's just go and talk to them. And I think particularly Chris was so bewildered that it was just this British couple 2 weeks before they were about to get married that he invited us to dinner. And that was my first experience actually before Bishop Barron. I'd invited this really wonderful American speaker called Chris Stefanik over to the UK. This was in 2017. So this was my first practice of having an American over. And he said, oh, I don't know, because I've got my wife and my 6 kids. And I said, bring them. I said, bring them along. Again, I'd not ever done anything like that. But I said, just bring them along and just make it happen. And yeah, he's been a really kind friend and mentor. And you think with these people, like these people you'd see or you feel very attached to because they've helped you so much at a distance.
Mm-hmm. To meet them in person.
To meet them in person, they always have this like, they'd be great to have a chat with at the pub type quality about them. And, thank God, well, they say never meet your heroes, but I've met my heroes and it's been great.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's something I've noticed about conferences in the Catholic world or famous people in the Catholic world versus my life before being in ministry, famous people in the business world. Famous people in the business world have a facade that they have to maintain. That you can't get to know me personally, because if you get to know me personally, familiarity may breed contempt. Now that's been my experience, and we did a TV series with a guy called Sir Jerry Robinson, may God have mercy on his soul, in our business. And, and I've had experience of other famous people beyond that. But then in the Catholic world, in the ministry world, it was so refreshing because people were just themselves, regardless of whether they were on a stage or not on a stage, they were the same person. And, it's just so refreshing. I'm curious about St John Henry Newman. How big a part of the church in England is he, the Catholic Church in England? He's a Catholic convert, or a Protestant convert to Catholicism, Anglican convert. That was a big deal for him to convert.
Seismic for himself and for the British establishment, because he was a central figure in the 19th century. So when he converts in 1845, I believe his sister never spoke to him again. He suffered public scorn and derision. He was in this spot where Catholics didn't trust him because it was like this convert and still kind of testing the waters. And then Charles Kingsley, for example, who basically publicly insulted him, saying like, oh, he was always just a kind of Romish spy, and he was always just just held on a bit longer, judging his integrity. I mean, thank God in a way it's like God uses or permits these things to happen because it's because of that furnace that we get the kind of the refining of fire of the apologia, this great testament to the development of his religious thought and his religious mind. And it was fascinating when we saw the coverage in the UK of Newman's canonization. So in fact, the then Prince Charles came to Rome and gave a speech, a really eloquent speech to an assembled gathering of which Bishop Barron was there, but lots of English and Irish bishops and priests. And he spoke really powerfully. And there were some really good articles, in the media. It was quite a good news story in a way. And also I noticed that Newman seems to have this, I think it's a great quality that he seems to be loved and accepted by every wing of the church. So you'd had for lack of a better phrase, the kind of the left-wing Catholic magazine and the right-wing Catholic magazine had Newman as their man equally for different reasons. He was so capacious and so generous and big in his thinking, he couldn't be contained by any particular movement. So I love that quality. And so I think that, his vision for an emancipated laity, his vision of holiness and his fight against liberalism in religion, all of these things, 150 years later are still so prophetic.
Gosh, I love your eloquence.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm just hold on, what was the first thing you said?
The words, I'm just like, wow. Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah. Emancipation of the laity. What was the second thing and the third thing that you said?
Good question. No,
Yeah.
so emancipation of the laity, his vision of what I'd call sympathetic influence or personal influence. So there was a sermon he preached while he was still an Anglican. It's one of the Oxford sermons. And he's vicar of St Mary's Cathedral, so the kind of the college chapel or the college church at Oxford University. And it was called Personal Influence, the Means of Propagating the Truth. So it's a fascinating insight into what Newman thought, this great giant of intellect. You'd think he would be arguing for apologetics on the basis of, of conscience or arguments for the existence of God. But no, he says it's holiness embodied. It says, it said paper logic is, or paper thinking is just the record of it. In many ways, he was already converted in his mind to the Catholic Church before 1845, but it said it took this kind of bedraggled Italian passionist priest called Dominic Barbary. He didn't speak a word of English, but left Italy because he said, I feel called to evangelize the English, even though I don't speak English. And he went, and Newman said it was like when he turned up in, a kind of cold evening, he said it was like the Seraph of Assisi turning up. It was holiness embodied in personal form. So he said that's the impact of personal influence. There's a kind of firmness of character to be able to persuade and to comfort. He says, how is it that truth has, when it always seems besieged over the centuries, still manages to persist? It's because there are people who are at once patterns and teachers of that truth. So it's that universal call to holiness. Newman's called the hidden father of Vatican II for reasons like that, this kind of prophetic vision. He's never mentioned in any of the documents.
It's a pity though, isn't it? Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. What was the third thing?
And what was the third thing? So emancipated laity, a vision of holiness and something else. I'm sure it'll come
passing
back
on
to
of
me.
the faith through that personal experience. Was that what you said, or was that linked to the vision of holiness? What I took from that was that basically it's influencing people by one-on-one conversation. From what you said, I think.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So I would say he was one of Newman's great gifts was he had this kind of apostleship of friendship. So like in the Oxford tutorial system or the seminar system, it's very, very kind of intimate, close quarters learning. Imagine it's like Jesus did close quarter discipleship. But you can't disciple people at a distance. There's got to be this, the Pope uses this lovely word, vicinanza, which means closeness. And he knew that in an educational sphere, the impact that closeness could have. And so liken that in discipleship. So he was a great friend, and you see it in every page of the Apologia, his kind of spiritual autobiography. This, he was you can learn a lot about friendship from Newman. So I think sometimes when I first saw an image of Newman, I thought, this is kind of very dry Victorian, kind of dusty looking old guy. And
well, he has a big nose and
yeah,
whatever.
exactly.
He's not
It's
particularly
very,
physically attractive looking.
Yeah, it's kind of like very, very kind of like austere looking. But that belies, his episcopal motto, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. And that radiates, like his whole life was that it was a man enthralled and encaptured by the love of God. And just that kind of permeated every bit of his, and he followed truth wherever it led. So that kind of integritas. So I continue all of these, years later after studying, of just continuing to find new reasons to be inspired by Newman and think he still has so much to teach us.
And is your knowledge typical of the English church, or are you out on your own in terms of, have you studied him in a master's? Or what? Why is it that you know so much, or is this typical of an English Catholic?
Be nice to say it was typical. No, so I'd say, especially because of the canonization, there's been a lot more emphasis on Newman. So it would be quoted very kind of liberally, in different talks and stuff. So it's very. I'd say he's a firm friend of. He's the most recently canonized English saint. There is a really great devotion that, as I say, kind of goes across. What traditional lines that people might draw. But I did my master's at Oxford, and I wanted to do it on Newman and the new evangelization understood in a British context. So in the 19th century, Newman made it possible for Englishmen to be Catholics again, for a way that almost didn't seem possible since the Elizabethan period, because you couldn't get more English than Newman. There's a Newman and there was another cardinal, Cardinal Manning, the two convert cardinals. And they just broke this mold. And, you couldn't say, this Romish and foreign and, Catholicism as other. And they just had this huge effect of.
And did you have a time whenever it was, I imagine like Ireland, because you were obviously ruling Ireland at the time, or your forebears were?
My Irish forebears.
Well, not your Irish forebears, your English forebears, but you're from Ireland, so we'll talk about that in a wee while. But or your lineage is, but we had Catholic emancipation officially, I think around 1820, something like that. Was it similar in the UK, similar in England?
Yeah, so you've got the restoration of the hierarchy that takes place in 1850. So there was a papal bull which kind of proclaimed that for the first time since Elizabethan England, you could have bishops. And if you've got bishops, you can have dioceses and parishes and kind of normality in the practice of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And this was met with uproar, like civil unrest. Churches had stones thrown through the window, priests beaten up in the streets. And Newman's reaction to this was fascinating because he said he would love to see that this commotion, this controversy, be an excuse for laity in particular to go out into the streets and giving lectures, and to see that controversy as an opportunity to
engage.
Yeah. And he didn't shrink from the task himself. In fact, in the Birmingham Oratory, he gave a series of public lectures, which is come to be known now as the present position of Catholics in England, I think. And they needed police to hold back the crowds. It was that kind of civil unrest. I don't know whether that still happens at the Birmingham Oratory, but yeah, he didn't shrink for that task himself, but positioned the focal point of the laity, like wanted the laity to see this as their opportunity.
Good for him. Good for him. And here we are. And you going back to your study of him and his influence on the new evangelization, or his advocacy of the new evangelization, even though it wasn't even a term at the time. How has he influenced the new evangelization now without getting credit for it?
So I guess in a way, Newman's really deep dive into history. So, he writes about the Arians of the 4th century, and, he's tracking all of these, because he'd had this position where he thought, oh, well, I'm not like the excesses of Rome, and I'm not like, an evangelical Christian. I'm somewhere this kind of via made it in the middle. But suddenly when he does his deep dive into history, he realizes that the Church of Christ was never in the middle. It was always on the extreme orthodox. It was always, on the side of right thinking and right teaching and right practice. And so in a way, he had to reluctantly become, as he might have thought before, an extremist. Yeah.
And was it that he saw flaws in the Anglican Church that he, initially piqued his interest, or what was it about, what started him off?
Yeah, it's said that at first he wanted a living principle by which to safeguard or have a surety for the foundations of faith. And he thought it can't be scripture, because scripture depends on other principles. It depends on the principle of the church. So he thought it must be the church fathers. And so actually, the church fathers can't be a living voice because they're in fact dead. It says, tradition. So it was tradition, and the church and stuff becomes this kind of living principle, but also symbolized by the office of the Pope, that kind of continues this apostolic succession. And you see throughout the Apologia, these kind of, all of these thoughts come together. This he says an idea is a kind of assemblage of different hunches and intuitions and facts, and all of these things come together. And you see that building in the Apologia. So, I barely remember what I had for breakfast, but he is able to say, I remember walking through the meadow of Christ Church, talking to Harold Froude, and I immediately there accepted the doctrine of apostolic succession. I was like, can think, really take apart his mind, like these kind of first beginnings at 14 years old, and, how he leaves this kind of like enlightenment atheism to this first kind of conviction, this first conviction of faith. So yeah, it's really, really remarkable.
Lovely. Back to Prince Charles. I am so not I'm so not impressed by Prince Charles, by what I see in the media. But then we watch The Crown, and it's not exactly verbatim or whatever. But there's a part of me that feels sorry for Prince Charles. I think he got a bad run of it. You know, it was tough for him. But you were really impressed by his speaking to the canonization, or speech at the canonization of John Henry Newman. Like, I heard about it, I read it in a headline. I didn't read what he actually said. What was so impressive about what he said?
I guess in a sense it felt very authentic. It wasn't like, oh, so, there's some English saint and my aide has just passed me some, memoir for me to read out. He clearly, whether he'd written it himself is irrelevant, but he delivered it with
conviction.
With panache and conviction, and clearly meant it. And, not only his contribution and Charles, I don't know what he was like in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I mean, in a way, like I was born in 1990, so my kind of memories of Charles is really as a kind of older man. But I must admit, like, aside from personal feelings about the monarchy, I'm deeply impressed by Charles. I think he's the most unenviable shoes to fill in the late Queen, and I think he's done it with great kind of dignity and this sense of the causes he goes. He's been very, very keen supporter of lots of different. He's been very supportive of Catholics and different causes, and takes that kind of role of defender of the faiths, as he calls it, kind of very seriously. Plural. It is, and that's his own. Yeah, so we'd have qualms about that for different reasons, but I think he very admirably lives up to that role.
And what is your personal opinion of the monarchy? Just as a matter of interest, not on the record or not representing Word on Fire, whatever. Like, what do you, Brendan Thompson, a descendant of Irish people living in England, think of the British monarchy?
Well, my full name is actually Brendan Alejandro Thompson Zurita de Peralta. I'm an Irish Venezuelan.
Wow, that's cool.
Yes, so I think constitutional monarchy is the best government going, basically. So I'm less concerned about the personality, actually, of the individual monarch, but I actually quite like constitutional monarchy. You see in the American system and in the French system, you see a kind of monarch-shaped whole that the symbolic weight that these individuals who also carry executive power have to inhabit. And I remember somebody remarked during the Queen's funeral, which was fascinating on a number of levels, right? Because one, the most widely watched event on television in human history, so I think it was 4 or 5 billion people watched it, was a liturgy.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it just showed that kind of, it's there in people's hearts. It's people's desire and needs for the sacred, sacred signs and symbols and ritual and liturgy to be able to express and to properly to mark something as seismic as that. And I remember someone remarked at the time saying, only the British could do this, with that sense of there's something of that symbolic weight that the monarchy and this tradition is able to convey. And
took themselves seriously as well, in an age where we could very easily sideline that sort of thing. I loved her. I loved the fact that she was married to her husband for so long. I don't like the fact that her kids haven't turned out as well as they could have done. I loved what she came to represent. I loved how she repaired, along with the Irish who worked with her, but she took her part and repaired really well a really violent period in our common history.
Yeah.
And I think she was so magnanimous and so good. And she didn't lose her cool at all. It doesn't mean to say she was perfect, but I think the world isn't as good a place without her being there. And people like her make sense for us of the world. That's what I think.
Such a long reign and really turbulent, because in a way it was the British Empire went from being top nation to basically, the cause of everybody's Independence Day, and it was that's a huge tumultuous thing to observe and oversee. And her job really was to be boring.
Mm-hmm.
And she was incredibly diligent. It's not a great gig to do for all of your life, to always be on show, to always, everything you do is public, to never be able to be your own person. There's a kind of selflessness, that you couldn't but admire. I think even if you're the staunchest Republican, I think even they would, look at the qualities of the late Queen and think, there is a life well lived, completely self-sacrificial, a vision of Christian dignity.
Totally agree. Couldn't agree more. What do you think, Sheena, of the Queen? Or have you thought about her? It's okay if you haven't thought about her.
I haven't, I don't think about her as much as you would have. And I think that's because I wasn't brought up as close to the north as you were. I come from the middle of Ireland. So the Queen, and the monarchy weren't really a big part of our conversation. But I would agree with you. Like, she did her job and totally selfless. So selfless. I do remember reading something about her. Oh, I read a book. Oh, jeepers, I can't remember. But there was a Protestant minister or something, and she was heavily influenced by him.
Like Billy Graham.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, kind of hats off to her.
She asked for a private meeting with Billy Graham, and of course they did meet. And I watched The Crown, therefore I know. And it's
expert.
Yeah, I'm an expert. But it's like, she clearly did have a Christian conviction. She was head of the Anglican Church in England. I'm sure the whole of the Anglican Church was praying for her, as they are for Charles now. But
so, what about you? What's your personal story? Like, how did you come to your faith, and what were you brought up in your faith?
So I sometimes joke saying I'm half South American, half Irish, so I had all the ingredients to be a lapsed Catholic. Just sad but true,
Yeah.
And but by the grace of God, when I was 18, and may never have darkened the doors of a church again, my Latin American mother tricked me into going on a pilgrimage. So she said, "Oh, do you want to go on a free trip to Australia?" I was like, "Oh yeah, it sounds amazing." Like, go backpack and find myself, whatever you do on these trips. And I found out 2 weeks later there was a pilgrimage. I was like, "Oh, very sneaky, Mum. I see what you did there." But I was like, I can put up with these Jesus people for a free trip to Australia. But I didn't know what it was. It was, World Youth Day. And I was like, I didn't know what it was. And nothing could have prepared me for, if you've never heard or, been to World Youth Day, it's kind of Catholic music festival, essentially, with the Pope on the main stage. And, it kind of had blown open all the categories that I'd had for the church. And this was going to mass every Sunday, having gone to a Catholic primary school, Catholic secondary school, a kind of fairly standard Catholic upbringing in England. And unfortunately, at its worst, what that upbringing can do is basically treat faith like the wallpaper. It's just there, or it gives you enough of a stick to beat the church with.
Mm-hmm.
That's
something
a very
new.
Good
way of putting it. Yeah,
and you need an encounter of that kind of grace to kind of break open this little box that I'd had the church in a box. Oh yeah, I know what this thing is, and that's why John Paul II says we need a new evangelization, because you feel like there's this thing I actually don't really know it on second reflection, but think I do, and have discarded it.
And so, did it give you a stick to beat the church with, or were you against the church, or was it just wallpaper, or a bit of both?
Yeah, it was. I remember when I was making my confirmation, so it was age 14, and you chose a name. I chose, the name of a heavenly sponsor. I chose the name Luigi, St. Luigi Orione, because I wanted my brother to choose the name Mario. That was the level of maturity I was operating. And it's not big, it's not clever, but that's where I was at. And, when you're 14, you think these kinds of things are, really hilarious,
funny.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's that. So it wasn't necessarily that I was like a rabid atheist. It was just more like kind of irrelevant. It's just kind of there, and it would just kind of the volume would turn down so much as to be non-existent.
Were your parents convicted about their faith growing up when you were there?
Yeah, so my dad, I would say, was kind of like, second generation Irish, very silent. He believes because he believes because he believes.
Yeah, don't talk about it.
You don't talk about it. But really a powerful witness looking back retrospectively. But, I had questions that needed to be answered. And then my mother had gone from being a punk in the 70s and 80s, like blue and pink hair, and then had this radical conversion. And then she'd gone completely the other way, and it's kind of like mantillas and rosaries coming out of every sleeve. And, it's gone from one extreme to the other, which also wasn't doing anything for me when I was 17 or 18.
Yeah.
But yeah, just that, I guess as an extrovert, that experience of going to World Youth Day and just seeing other young people, it's like, oh, you can do this and be normal.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to have it all figured out. But also, it wasn't even just on the social or affective level, because there are other things you can do if you want to be social. But it was like the priest celebrated Mass so reverently, like they held up the Eucharist for a kind of prolonged period of time. And it just made me think, was something here? And I'd had this profound encounter in confession where basically, don't know whether he should or not, but it worked out well in the end. The priest basically challenged my view of God. He said, you're just speaking about a God that's made in your own image, Brenden. Your penance is to go and, basically, I can't remember how he put it, but basically have some more humility. And I was like, gosh, this is a bit, what's that all about? And all of these things just helped to widen, to break those frames, that picture I'd had of the church. So it was hugely grace-filled, and it's really my life since then. So since 18 has been kind of working out the grace of that, that first encounter.
Wow. And what happened after World Youth Day? You came home to England?
Yeah, so I'd had these plans to go to university, and then decided I didn't want the Jesus thing to end. And I had enough self-knowledge at 18 to know that if I just went and did something else, I'd lose it. I said, I need to go all in for this thing. So I went to the priest leader of this trip. Now, bear in mind, at the start of the trip, I'd been so obnoxious. One of the trip leaders had asked for my passport, and I had been fully emancipated as an 18-year-old. So I said, why do I have to give you my passport? Well, you don't think I can look after it myself? And they basically got the priest to kind of talk me down, and I gave it eventually. And at the end of the week, I said, I've never been on a retreat, but can I work at this youth retreat center? All these people had applied for a year to be there, and I was trying to go like 2 weeks before and just join this team to serve on mission for a whole year, clearly unqualified. And this priest, Father Dominic, I'll never forget, he took a risk, and it wasn't obvious that it was a good thing to do. And the person who was the leader at the house said, actually, when she first met me, that she thought I'd just be one of these kind of World Youth Day fads, here now, gone by Christmas. And, he took a risk in that moment, saw something in me, even moved someone who was a second-year volunteer out of a room so that I would have space. He made space for me. And I wouldn't be here were it not for that priest taking a risk. And so I worked at that youth retreat center for a number of years, and things carried on.
Yeah. And what happened after working at the youth retreat center?
So I must admit, actually, so the youth retreat center was an amazing experience. I just got this bug. I got hungry for formation. There's like, you're doing this work, but I need to know more, and there's so much more to know. And I was just kind of at the start of it. So I went and did a youth ministry degree and then a theology degree.
Where?
At St Mary's in Twickenham. It's kind of Catholic University in London. Lived in a chaplaincy house called Benedict XVI House. It was named after Pope Benedict had visited St Mary's. And so I studied theology, and it was around that time when I'd just first started studying theology that I'd watched the Catholicism series. It was around that time of I was talking to other people my own age who were studying theology, kind of Catholic students at university. And then I was hearing this very exciting American preacher talk about these things. And it was giving me a language for those things that I'd been, in a way, so moved by in mission and in World Youth Day. And it's just that exciting. When you hear formation for the first time in your mind, it just fires your imagination, and you just want to tell everyone. So it's amazing that kind of falling in love with formation and seeing how the life of the mind isn't just kind of academia, but it's a kind of firing of the imagination. So it was it was really transformational time, in my early 20s. Very blessed that, all of this happened to me quite young in a way.
Yeah. Like Sheena's studying a master's in Augustine Institute at the minute in pastoral theology. And
I can so relate to what even your eyes are lighting up. It's if I was to make one complaint, it's I'm sorry, I didn't know this in my 20s. Yeah. But a priest friend said, isn't it great you're learning about it in your 50s? It's never too late. But yeah, it's blowing my mind what I'm learning.
So good. You were in seminary at one stage, you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so that call, which I would say was for a deeper Christian life, manifest itself. So I thought, okay, well, I'm a young man, I should discern a call to the priesthood. So I went to my vocation director, who was that Father Dominic, the one who was leading that trip to me at World Youth Day. So it all felt kind of very providential. And so I went and very wisely, they sent me to go finish my degree as a seminarian, first of all, at St Mary's. So I was that third year. And then I went to Spain for a year. So the English college in Valladolid in Spain. It's very historic college. It's got all of the portraits of some of the martyrs of the English Reformation that had studied there. Kind of have this sense of a bond, this kind of spiritual fraternity as part of this. These people who self-sacrificially went and served the mission of the church, and that gave me a sense of actually that I've never lost since, which is whatever I do, whatever God is calling me to do, I'm here to serve the mission of renewal in the church in England. To stand in their spiritual footsteps. The ground that they'd laid before me, these English martyrs, but also that whole pre-Reformation tradition as well. I just started seeing all of these kinds of connections. So I'd done that. I'd done that year at Valladolid, and it was great. It taught me to pray with the church, like praying the office. Like I'd done it occasionally, but when you do it with a sense of routine and for a protracted period of time, it does something to your being, right? And just, that it's not just about you and your own prayers, but kind of locking into or the prayer of the church. I loved that element. When I didn't feel like praying, it was like you're keying into the kind of, the frequency of grace that's all around the world and, space and time. Wherever you are, there's somewhere mass being celebrated. There's always an office being prayed, and you're kind of keying into that. And growth in love of adoration and continuing that intellectual formation. So it was a really blessed time.
Beautiful. We did the office last night with an alumni who's now a priest, and it was just beautiful.
It was really, really beautiful. It would make you want to have more. And I think I would have been quite, standoffish about it before, just from what I'd heard, because I'd never really experienced it, and it was just so beautiful. And you commented actually that you felt united with all the people around, all the priests around the world.
All the religions.
Pray.
Youth ministry sets you up for expecting things to go, things to be very impactful, emotionally, like right then and there, and in your face. Whereas the office is like, the image I always have is, like a pebble just kind of being rolled by the water, that its effect is cumulative over time. So it's not always is the most exciting thing to do.
Yeah.
But it's that perseverance and that faithfulness. And then over time, you kind of notice, wow, every day I've saturated myself morning and evening in the scriptures, kind of bathed in the Psalms.
I'm being changed in a profound way, but it's not in a sensational way.
Yeah.
It's deep and it's very real. You just said something that struck me, like youth ministry, which we both worked in, you worked in, we work in, is very loud and in your face. You didn't use those words, but I'm using them. And this is something, that's really for the youth minister, that to keep them, because it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. Youth ministry. You ended up in youth. Sorry, let's talk about seminary. Go on first after seminary.
Well, after seminary, I discerned. Well,
what about seminary? Where did you go to seminary after Valladolid?
I didn't. So that was the thing, is that I'd come back home at Christmas, and previously I'd met the woman who is now my wife. Spoiler. But we were just friends. And it wasn't until I got back at Christmas and I said, whoa, something's different here. And I remember to talk to a very wise, my very wise spiritual director, who said, look, the thing is, you're young and you'll fall in love, and you'll fall in love again and fall out of love. So you need to test this. I'm not saying it isn't love, but, test it. So first of all, tell her, because you can't be in love on your own. It's just to involve another person. So I spoke to Laura, and she'd told me that she'd been in love with me for ages, the whole time, and had gone through this kind of tumultuous time of like letting me go. And then I was ruining it by telling her I liked her after she'd just gotten over it. And I was a very oblivious man, like, oh, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
And so then I delivered the bad news of saying, okay, so we both feel this way. My spiritual director has said we should not speak for 6 months now. Kind of can't remember what he calls it, like a Moriartium, like a silence, basically, a great silence. Thank God she was Catholic, so she could kind of like be on board with, no, okay, we need to discern this properly, and this will help us to do it. So we didn't speak for 6 months. And
hats off to you.
It was really hard. I guess it was easier because I was in Spain and she was there, and this was this everything. Yeah. We had smartphones, but it was the early days of smartphones, so it was easier to do it. But still, it was difficult, and it wasn't until I basically got to a point where I was at a silent retreat, and I knew I'd be there for a week, and I was like, God, at the end of this week, I'm gonna have an answer. It's not like it's a if, I will have an answer. And just praying it the whole week, and it became clear to me. I was like, no, I think this is having tested this, I think this is something genuine. And so I wrote Laura a love letter, and I sent it to her. Well, actually, the first draft was a bit too messy, so I wrote a second draft that was very presentable, and I sent that to her. And then I kept asking her every day, have you got the letter yet? She's like, no. Have you got the letter yet? She said, I'd obviously tell you if I got the letter. And then I couldn't wait for her to open it. So I read the first draft, the first messy draft to her, and then said, look, after I come back, I'm going to finish the year in Valladolid because I want to finish what I've started. But, let's be together after this. And she was like, yes. And the day that was the day that Pope Francis was elected Pope.
Wow.
That was like March 2013, or I think March or February 2013. But yeah, so it was, I just always, it was a beautiful. And then I came home at Valladolid for the end of that year, and she met me at Heathrow Airport. And then we got on the Piccadilly line on the London Underground, and I said, I suppose I'd better ask you out formally. Will you be my girlfriend? And that's good. And yeah, it's just, we've been married 8 years now, Laura, my beautiful wife, Laura, and we've got 3 little girls, 5, 3 and 1. So yeah, so there's been the adventure of family life is great.
So I'd be interested to know, because we have a lot of young men and women who are discerning their vocations. And when you said you parked it for 6 months, how, what was your decision making on the silent retreat? Was it like your love for her didn't go away? Is that what helped you to make the decision? Or
how did you know that she was the one? Was it a sense that you had, or did God speak to you?
So one of my formators in seminary actually kind of very wisely said, Brenden, you've been involved in youth ministry. So I think it will inevitably have trained you to be sensitive to external affirmation for what you're doing. So to really desire that. So I said, your challenge in formation will be basically to wean yourself off of that, because it will have been like a drug. And like you say, youth ministry doesn't feel like a sprint. Young people it's one of the amazing qualities about youth, isn't it? That it's like there's an abandon. I gave my life at 18 in this very dramatic way.
And young people are all in, and they do not like compromise. They do not like easy. And that's a beautiful thing. And if we can tap into that and realize they don't like, half measures.
Yeah.
But go on.
Yeah. Just like that, like Jesus says, don't be child, to such as these is the kingdom of heaven inherited. And people don't often say it about teenagers or young people, but there is that quality. And I remember it myself. So that's the light, but the shade, there's always a shade side, is that it can be quite fickle. If you've talked with anyone who's worked in university ministries, you will never start any program on time. You can't be assured that the same group of people who were there last week will be there the following week. So that comes with the territory, doesn't it? It's all, and there are other advantages and disadvantages later. But so I basically, in that discernment, I had to learn how to discern. I had to learn. So that was the chief lesson, which was I don't want this to just be based on a feeling.
Yeah.
So I subjected myself to saying, I'm not going to just be deciding what am I feeling or sensing within, but just read scripture, do spiritual reading. I'm actually just going to try not to think about it in a way and see what is prompted. Like, are there words and images that come that help to interpret some of the things that I'm feeling? Like, am I being too impatient? Or I just learned to kind of take that discernment out of my own head.
Wow.
And I always say that about discernment, which is you can't do any real discernment on your own, because, we're human beings, we're made for communion. And you notice it in the life of a priest, actually. So much of the discernment some of it has to do with the individual, and the desire is important, but then they have to talk to a spiritual director a vocations director, and then they have to be accepted, and there are liturgical rites, and we can subject some of our own discernment to that. So it's to involve other people and the mind of the church and the tradition of the church. So I guess I learned that in that crucible where I really needed to make a decision of how to take discernment out of the realm of the ego.
So just to put this, can I frame this now in a different way than you're presenting it just now? You liked Laura.
Yeah.
Laura liked you. Like, you were in love with Laura. Laura was in love with you, but you weren't making that the decider. What you were saying is you wanted God to tell you if this was the path he wanted you to live your life. Is that what I'm hearing you say? Through these stages that your spiritual director helped you discern.
Yeah. And that same spiritual director, I also realized he'd been preparing me for this, because he said, So the difficulty with you, Brenden, is that you could make a great priest or a great husband, and actually you'll just have to, discern and find a way. And he always used to say phrases like, the English people don't have a great phrase for love. Well, the Italians have got a great phrase, "Ti voglio bene," I want your good. I could see that he was teaching me, like Aquinas said, to love is to will the good of the other as other. So it was all those lessons in love. And I guess in that moment, it was like, it's to ponder on love. Is it just a romantic feeling, and to stretch my understanding and my will and my intellect to try and do that? Because I thought, okay, well, actually, if I love Laura, I want to will her good. I would say I'm in love with her, but love is mutual. It's reciprocal.
Or is it what's the greater agape?
Yeah. So it's basically trying to move from that. It's like, is this just because? Then you have to kind of try and be honest with yourself, and you've got time in a retreat of saying, like, there are lots of human reasons why, somebody might feel like they're called to priesthood or called to religious life or called to be married to someone. You think, I'm kind of running away. I'm settling. I'm doing all this, and you just be honest, and that can still be there. And just to say how important is that, and how can I love this person, and am I making a good decision, to try and untangle, like. To discern means, like, it comes from Latin discernere, which means like to cut or to decide. Just trying to take all these complex influences and basically find out what are the real goods or the apparent good, the spirit of consolation, the spirit of desolation. There's this kind of art of discernment, and you learn it in trying to make big, important decisions.
I want to go back to something you said.
Gosh, I think this is fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I do, yeah.
Wow.
So at a more human level, your spiritual director was saying to you, well, the trouble with you is that you would make a good priest and you'd make a good husband. I would say, and this is not me being flippant, but I would say a requirement for a good priest is that he would make a good husband.
Yeah.
So, and a good father, because it's the same qualities that we need. He needs to be a good man.
Amen.
And self-sacrifice.
Self-sacrificing, willing to lay his life down for his bride, be it the church or his wife.
I remember a priest friend said, it doesn't matter if you leave seminaries, you have to do discernment, but it's the best husband training you could get. So it's teaching that what is a priest isn't a priest for himself, he's a priest for his people. It's that self-sacrificial fatherhood, living spiritual fatherhood. I remember another priest friend, he met somebody out of prison who'd just come out of prison. No one else was there to meet him, not mother, father, there was no one else around. It was just this priest. And he gave this priest a huge bear hug and cried and said, "You've been the closest thing to a father I've ever had in my life."
Wow.
He said, any idiot with the right equipment can make a baby, but to be someone to live that spiritual fatherhood, you're called to do it just as much as as an ordained father, live it out, or as a biological father. It still takes that carrying your cross and that self-sacrificial love. Yeah.
Amen. Tina, what's your next question?
I'm still back. I think we could do a whole podcast on discerning big decisions, honestly, because I've never heard it articulated like that. To put the feelings aside and really ponder on what's going on deep inside.
Well, I think the feelings are important, and I think they should be our principal guide. This is what I personally think, and I'm not educated in Ignatian discernment. I actually think that they
Well, I think the Lord can use them, but from what I'm hearing you say is that you park them and go deeper.
Well, it's part of the complex mass of influences, isn't it? So we're mind, body, and spirit. We're it's all connected. So so the feelings do matter, and it's
like if he wanted you to be a priest, you would want to be a priest. Like he puts that on your heart. It's a gift to you and he's obviously letting you decide in the same way he was letting you decide whether you wanted to be a priest or a husband. And he put he gave you the gift of falling in love with Laura. That's what I think. Yeah. And it's not to say that what you're saying isn't true, but I'm trying to simplify it down to it's good to test it. It's good to test our own motives. But we don't have to get ahead of ourselves. Like we don't know what we don't know until we know them. And I'm talking about myself, in terms of marrying you, Sheena, I hadn't a clue what I was doing, but I knew I was in love with you. And that for me was and I had been well enough formed. My parents had a good marriage. I'd been well enough formed growing up to know that, or to think that me together with you, we could do something similar to what my parents did with me and my brothers and sister. And so that was enough for me. And I had enough confidence to think, yeah, we can pull this off, and it's yeah. And then you went to America and I'm like, do we want to make this work? And of course we made it work. Thanks be to God. But I think it's both and I think it's like sometimes we work with young people a lot ourselves. And sometimes we are so much in our head that we lose what is on your heart. Please slow down and sure, take this afterwards. But what are you feeling like? And I'm not in a flippant sort of a, what do you call that? Where you fall, there's a word for you're so impulsive, not in an impulsive way, but in a, like, what is the long feeling in my heart? Like, what is that there? And you did it for 6 months, that.
Yeah.
That's a game changer.
I guess partly the principle I was trying to articulate was that you are probably not, I'm not the best judge of myself and my own feelings. And so that needs to be tested by being in conversation with the Lord and giving time for that, because actually time is like, your feeling might change over the course of months and stuff. So actually time is a really good aspect of discernment. You can't rush a process because how you feel about this decision in winter might be very different to summer. So there's time. There's also involving, putting it in prayer, because sometimes you say like, oh yes, we'll pray about it, but you never actually really sit there in front of the tabernacle and just try and focus your mind simply on that. And not that you're trying to force answers, but you're just trying to say, Lord, I don't know what to do with this. It's, very much praying like the Psalms of just almost just externally processing, not trying to kind of psychologize it or figure it out. And I think in that there's a beautiful image that Pope Francis uses about what a discerner is trying to be, is like a sommelier. It's like someone who can, to the wines of the wine of the spirits of the wine or whatever, that you can smell, someone who is trained. I can barely tell red and white. Like, I go through that fast at a restaurant. I was like, yep, it's definitely red. But, I've got a friend who did, I was at Valladolid. She was studying to be a sommelier and she could smell, and get those very subtle notes. But that takes training. And there's something similar, I think, with discernment, that there's the tradition of the church, other people, and time can help you to sense those notes.
Yeah, I'm a bit slow on the uptake. So what I'm really saying is you were discerning what I'm really figuring out. And let me just articulate this. You were discerning leaving the priesthood.
Yeah.
What I was doing was I was just in love with this woman. And I wasn't, I was into my faith. And because I was into my faith, people would say to me, a few people said to me, you should think about the priesthood. I'm like, I have no desire whatsoever, not interested. And it's not that I think any less of the priesthood. I just wasn't called. And I knew I wasn't called. And so it was, is this woman a good woman? Do I think we could have a really good life? She wanted a big family like me. And therefore here we are, 7 kids and 1 grandchild and 2 more on the way. And, and so that's the thing. You were right to do what you did, and that it was a much bigger decision for you.
Yeah.
And in terms of you were leaving the priesthood to be to be a married man, to be a great married man, clearly, and a father and a husband and but to lay your life down in a different way than you were called to if you were going to be a priest. Yeah.
I was a bit thicker, so I think God just needed to make it a bit more of an ultimatum for me.
Well, you had the difference between X and Y, whereas you had already chosen Y.
Yeah, X wasn't an option for me.
Yeah.
What? Sorry, go on.
No, I do have a question, and it's completely left field. It's nothing to do. Well, it is a bit to do with what we were talking about earlier. You talked about Newman being a great example of what it is to be a good friend, or what friendship is truly about. And I have just finished in my book club. We have just finished reading C.S. Lewis, Four Loves.
4 Loves, yeah.
No clue what he was talking about. Like I wish I did, but I don't really.
We listened to that together in the car.
Yeah.
Both of us read it before, and then we listened to it together, and it actually made a lot of sense though.
Like,
when we listened to it together,
like,
I don't mean to contradict you, but
Well, bits of it made sense, but he talks about like out of a group of 1,000 people, 900 people will never have experienced true friendship. And then you talk about Newman, he was really the embodiment of friendship, and then how that true friendship is kind of evangelization territory. You know what I mean?
Was Newman buried with his best friend? Was that him, or am I
Was
mixing it up?
yes, what's it? Something St Cloud. I can't remember what it was called, but yes, buried his friend.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really good point to return to, because I think actually in many ways, one of the things I've noticed is that there is a real poverty of authentic friendships. Like I've seen these studies where, especially men, once they get past their 30s, they have no genuine or sincere friendships. There's an epidemic of like loneliness. It's not just among men, but among, where are these deep friendships? And you think, there's profound reflections on friendship. Have you ever seen that film? Is it Paul the Apostle of Christ? It had Jim Caviezel in it, who played Jesus in the Passion of the Christ.
Yeah.
And it was the friendship of Paul and Luke. And it just is their friendship. And I remember thinking, watching this film, like that friendship which they portray so well gave us basically 3/4 of the New Testament, Acts of the Apostles and the Gospel of Luke and Paul and all of Paul's letters and stuff. But you just watch that kind of the friendship. It was like, a nuclear fission. It was just generative and creative. And the same, you bring up C.S. Lewis, his friendship with Tolkien and like the Inklings and stuff. That was again, a kind of nuclear reactor of grace for apologetics and, two of the greatest apologists of the 20th century. And it just formed in that furnace of friendship, and, Tolkien leading him into the faith and stuff. So there's something really profound in the kind of recovery of friendships. And Newman's a great teacher in that regard, I'd say.
You're touching close to the bone with your talk about deprivation of friendship in men beyond 30 years of age. I was just talking to a man this evening about that, it's funny. I was saying we had an alumni over. I was praying for a friend, and I have friends, but I was praying for a friend, and it was this alumni's dad who came along, and it was just like, the Lord was saying to me, he's your friend, and he's older than me, but he's a good man, and he's the sort of guy we can go for breakfast and chat and whatever. But it speaks to that lack in the culture of, like, I'm an ideas person. I like sport and all the rest, but I'm an ideas person. I like talking about thoughts and, philosophy, not in an academic sense, but, in an applied sense. And we are weird. Like, we, as in people like me who chat about stuff, are weird, or chat about whatever. We're just like, and when I say, I'm not assuming that you're the same as me, but I'm saying that there's a lack of ability. I think I like to assume through rose-tinted glasses that England is better than that, are better at men being friends than Ireland, because we just don't talk. Our faith is emblematic of our philosophy on life. We don't talk about it. We just get through it. Do you understand what I mean? And I feel the lack of that in myself in Ireland. And I was just talking with somebody today about this.
No, and I feel it in my own life, even as a Christian, because you think, well, when was the last time you asked someone how they were and they didn't say they were busy? It's the kind of ultimate, the ultimate accolade and sin of this age. Yeah. And so therefore, where would you have time? Because to have a real friendship means you'd have to waste time with one another, having these moments, having the presence of mind to think, well, how is that person doing? And I need to really get back to them. And, that requires space, emotionally. And, there's all these things to cultivate.
Vulnerability as well, like building up trust.
Yeah.
Building up trust to the point where we can actually really be ourselves with another man. Like, I can be really myself with my wife.
Yeah.
But there are very few men that I can be really, really be myself. And it takes time to build that up. And thankfully in the faith, there are more that I can, but I feel the absence of that. Yeah. Just anyway.
I would love to, I'd love to know what does it mean to be a friend? I'd love to break that open. is it that you feel seen, and also that you can see others? Because sometimes we tend to focus a lot on our that absence within ourselves, you know, of our lack of friendship with others. But, you know, we equally have to ask ourselves, are we being good friends?
Totally.
You know, to others.
But I think by asking that question, we end up, when we're in a group of people, because we have a bit of formation and we're sometimes a bit older, sometimes not, but we tend to find, we're both leaders, and we tend to find ourselves in a position of leadership because you just see the need and you're like, okay, this needs to be done, so you go and do it. Or, you know, you mobilize other people to do whatever it is that's actually needed in any given situation. But that's not feeding that need for us as a couple to actually be friends with other people, just with nothing to give, you know, other than just spend time with them. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Word on Fire. What's the story? What's your job like? What's your purpose? What is it that your title is? Head of Word on Fire in the UK?
Program director. UK program director.
So what do you do, and what is it that you want to achieve?
Yeah, so I spent the first year really trying to discern, to take time. So saying yes to different speaking gigs across Europe to try and promote, you know, that something is happening with Word on Fire. There's this investment going on. I've been planning a conference. So I said I'd done this conference with Bishop Barron before. And I basically, one of the things that I had thought is that these conferences are very usual in America, but they're not in England or the UK quite so much. So wouldn't it be good? You know, Word on Fire as an organization is robust enough to be able to take on that risk in a way that many English organizations are not. So I thought, could we have maybe something biennially, once every 2 years? And so it was, you know, kind of stewarding that. So we're going to have, I mean, the moment as I talk to you now, in the moment of kind of planning that conference on the Bible, so seeing that part of the vision and stewarding a community. There's about 200-300 subscribers of the Word on Fire Institute, which is the kind of online platform in the UK. Just discerning, okay, there's this online community of people who like Word on Fire or like Bishop Barron, but what does that mean? What could that be? And so I guess the process of the year has helped me to boil it down to one question, because there is lots of goods, lots of things you could do, like could make resources and do all these events, but I didn't want to just be activity for the sake of activity. So I boiled it down to the one question, which is, let's say, how can we help lay people to evangelize in the UK?
Good for you.
And I think that's one of the central challenges of our day, is like, why don't more lay people evangelize? And I it's funny, as I ask that question all the way, there's always quite different diagnoses as to why, but no one ever questions the assumption underneath it that not enough lay people evangelize. You know, everyone accepts that, at least in the West, I can only speak for particularly the Anglophone world, that there's a problem. It's just like there's a poverty of confidence, of connection. So
Yeah,
there's all these defense.
This whole conversation that we're having is testament to that, and even going back to what you were saying about John Henry Newman. What I took from that was the conversation, one-on-one conversation, just through friendship.
Yeah,
you know, evangelizing through friendship.
What do you think? What do you think the problem is?
So I boil it down to those. I try and make it simple for myself by thinking of three C's. So I say there's a confidence problem. People are not confident, and that might have to be like not knowing, not feeling like it's my job to do, misunderstanding what the word evangelization means, like having kind of false or, you know, kind of misunderstandings or a bad image around it. So it makes you lack confidence, like confidere, like with trust and faith. It's like, doesn't make you step out if you don't feel like, oh, you know, that's very kind of scary. The lack of connection, I also diagnose as well. So it's like this loneliness, and there's loneliness in the church. I remember talking to somebody, I was running a program in a parish, and this woman said, oh, I'm going to come to this program because I've been a parishioner for 20 years and never really spoken to anyone. And I was like, you could be in a parish for 20 years and be anonymous.
Wow.
Perfectly like just, I mean, and of course she could have spoken to somebody, and maybe this was her way of rectifying that, but also she was never noticed. You could just
drift in and out.
Yeah. So, and because it's already hard enough to be a Catholic, because for most people in England, at least, you're the only one in your friendship group, might be the only one at work. You're always fight there. So, and if church is a place where you're also kind of anonymous, you know, communion is intrinsic to mission. So that connection, so you need to kind of sow that connection again, for the same way that we're speaking about friendship. Friendship is the ordinary form of evangelization that's essential. And then the defense mechanism, I guess, is that we only ever do evangelization initiatives that speak to the already converted. And that's different from formation. We need formation. We need we need the sacraments and the life of grace, and we need formation. But sometimes you discern that we're not doing anything for mission because we're frightened. So it's actually, I call it cultural literacy, being able to read high culture, popular culture, the signs of the times, the needs of the culture. Just like I start seeing things through a Catholic lens and trying to look for those opportunities to announce Christ.
Absolutely. And
you sound like Jack Valero.
Yeah.
But he's one of my mentors. So.
To make connection with people at, something that they can relate to that's not religious, and then build from there. Yeah. Well, you're clearly Irish, living in England. You might be third generation. Are there any particular nuances of living are you living in Oxford now, or where are you living?
Yeah, about half an hour out of Oxford, like a town in Oxfordshire.
Are there any particular nuances that you notice living in England with a name, Brendan Thompson, Venezuelan bits at the end? Do you normally pronounce the bits at the end, or do you just go with Brendan Thompson?
I do for flourish. If I'm giving a talk or something.
Very good.
No, it's funny. I've always thought about this, my identity, let's say, as a Brit, because I would sound and come across as a Brit, but there's very little that's British about me, really. And it made me think when St Bede, who was the only English doctor of the church, he wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English Peoples, plural. So actually, in that writing of the history of the British peoples, he was announcing England or Britain as a spiritual unity before it was even a political unity. So England or Britain, at its best, has always been a kind of hodgepodge of lots of different things. And I think the Catholic Church in the 19th century was a testament to that as well, because what was to be a British Catholic was to be an Irish immigrant or a French person fleeing the revolution. And so in a way, that's how I understand my identity as a British Catholic, which is that even if you've been in the country for 5 minutes and you go to London, and actually Bishop Barron said when he was in London, this is the most cosmopolitan city in terms of like the church population that he'd ever seen in the world. Even if you're here for 50 years or 5 minutes, you're kind of incorporated into this British Catholicism. It has a kind of Catholicity in its bones, I'd say. It goes deep into that, that very kind of ancient sense of this bringing together of diversity into unity.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you fit in really well into the British Catholicism that you experience.
Yeah, exactly.
We're experiencing a lot of inward migration in Ireland, and Dublin has become like London, like it's unrecognizable. And it's like I'm personally coming to terms with, I walked down O'Connell Street late at night, and I didn't feel safe because it wasn't the Dublin that I was used to. And it was like I didn't recognize, I didn't see any Irish people. They were all people speaking foreign languages and whatever. And this is all new. So we're at that stage where we're coming to terms with what that actually means for us, and how we should react, in a healthy, positive way. Yeah, as Catholics. Yeah.
Interesting. So I grew up in East London, and the previous generation, so like before my parents' generation, the wave of immigration would all been Irish. When I was growing up in the 90s, it was all the Irish had moved out in the kind of second generation, and they were replaced by African, like Nigerian, Congolese and stuff. So I was like one of the 10% white people in my school that was largely Afro-Caribbean. So I had a completely opposite experience to lots of people, where I was kind of like the one white kid kind of going around. So it's kind of like, whenever I think about that situation of like this, what I've noticed actually often what can happen in Britain, at least, and I've noticed this actually in the Catholic context, which is that it can become quite monocultural. So actually, you look on the surface, it can look like the community is quite diverse, but actually, let's say in a parish in London, you've got Poles, you've got the Filipinos, you've got the Nigerians, you've got that. And they never do they mix.
Wow, that's yeah. And I'd love if we don't end up there. I'd love if we do mix, but I can see like that we have a Filipino community that've been here 10 years. We have a lot of Polish there, and there's some mixing, but there's still a lot. We stick to our own. We stick to what we know. Yeah.
And there's a beauty to retaining one's tradition. It's not about being subsumed into that, like, because that's unity doesn't mean uniformity, is it?
Yeah, totally.
You can do that without losing into this kind of homogenous blob. But it's that kind of solidarity and being able to, to the parish to be the parish community. The parish has to, I guess, in a sense, be reimagined for the 21st century, and that's part of the dynamic, at least in an increasingly globalized world. Like, how does the parish help to be this kind of engine of solidarity?
What does it mean to be British?
To live on the British Isles.
Okay.
I guess.
Yeah. And I'm asking guests, what does it mean to be Irish? You know, what is Irishness? You know, so that we can hold on to that without throwing it down people's throats who are new to the country, but at least introduce them to the concept. This is what we think being Irish is, and we'd love you. You're very welcome here. We'd love you to be a part of this, you know. And I'm not sure we know we've thought about it. I think British people are better at actually thinking about what's going on in their head and thinking thoughts, you know, back to what I said earlier. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's just a misconception I have. But I think we have to grow into that, you know, what's going on in our heads. Brenden, it's been great having you. Thanks very much.
Such a joy. Thank you so much.
So we have one last question.
Yeah. What's the question?
So we usually ask everybody just at the end of the podcast, if you would like to share with the viewers and ourselves, is there something in particular that the Lord is speaking really clear to you in your prayer time, or something you're reading at the moment that's having a profound effect on you? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If there's anything you can think of.
So I'm thinking a lot about commitment, about being committed to things, because I feel like I'm the sort of person that kind of like a moth to the flames at the next exciting project. And I'd heard this quote from a saint called Saint Camillus: as commitment is doing what you said you would do when the feeling you said it in has gone away.
Wow.
So, you know, and it's classic. You go to a conference and stuff, it's like, oh Lord, I'm change. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this project. And it's actually, as I'm trying to think about this, stewarding this own vision in my life, I've been given this opportunity, but I can see that it's not just a quick burn. It's going to take time. And so I can't just be starting new projects here. And I'm just thinking about that commitment and that phase of life, and with my family as well, like trying to make that pattern of my own life more predictable. So to just that, I guess for anyone else who that's a kind of word of encouragement, like, you know, keep committed despite the feelings, and maybe it keys into the things we were saying about discerning and having those friendships and connections that will help us to persevere and stay committed.
Yeah.
And you are a pioneer, really, you know, with, you're pioneering from a good base with Word and Fire, but you still are a pioneer, you know, developing this, what you're going to develop. Yeah. So all the best with that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. Sheena, what about you?
I was thinking about this earlier, that this question was going to come up, and there's so many things. I feel like I'm in a time where the Lord is revealing a lot to me about myself, about things that I do habitually that are not necessarily good things, you know. But I don't feel the weight of them. You know, it's not like I feel crippled
condemned.
or condemned. It's just like the veil has been lifted off certain things. And it's hard because obviously it's stuff I need to work on. But I don't know what he's preparing me for. And maybe it, like what you said earlier, like we can talk about the faith, but we have to live it, you know, and we have to be good witnesses, and to be aware of the times that we don't live up to what we're talking about. So I feel like the Lord is like, well, you know, that little thing you do there, you need to try and stop that. Yeah.
Good for you. So my brother is a Muslim, and he married a Muslim woman, and they have kids who are brought up in the Middle East. And we were up my mother's house at the weekend, and my mother was saying we got into a conversation, an ideas conversation, and it was about Israel and Palestine. They'd be very pro-Palestine. No problem with that. I'm not particularly pro either Israel or Palestine. I'm just pro peace, and I don't like people blowing other people up. either ethnicity. But my mother was saying, and this would be the motto of the Irish and the motto of our household: religion and politics don't mix, in conversation. Whereas that's the stuff of life, and I was saying to her, we have to talk about this. We're not arguing. We disagree, but we're not, there's not any emotion in this. And it's unless we talk about this stuff, we're just cramming it underground again. And it's just going to surface in a missile somewhere, rather than us having a conversation and trying to understand each other. And worst thing that can happen is we agree to disagree, but at least if we try and understand each other, we'll be better off by having the conversation. So that's really where I'm at. Yeah, I feel convicted to actually have uncomfortable conversations and end as friends with people.
Thank you. I do not. I'm so non-confrontational. It's just, but I'm growing.
Yeah, you're getting better. Brendan, thanks so much, and God bless you, and all the best.
And
with
next
Word on
time,
Fire.
Bring your wife and children with you.
Yeah,
I will.
Yeah.
Good on you.
God
Mike,
bless.
thanks so
Mike.
much. Appreciate it. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's free. Share with your family and friends. Enjoy.